Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Our guest today is an acclaimed American historian and literary critic, renowned for her ability to weave compelling narratives that connect historical events to contemporary issues. Brenda Wineapple is the author of several award-winning books, including The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson, and The Dream of a Just Nation, a New York Times notable book, and Ecstatic Nation, Confidence, Crisis, and Compromise, 1848 to 1877, also named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times. Her work, White Heat, The Friendship of Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award as well. A recipient of prestigious honors such as the Guggenheim Fellowship, a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and 3 National Endowment for Humanities fellowships, Wineapple teaches in the MFA program at Columbia University and the New School. She is here today to talk about her latest book, Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation, which offers a vivid exploration of the 1925 Scopes trial, where she illuminates its enduring relevance to America's cultural and political divides. For those taking notes, the Scopes trial, officially the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, was a landmark 1925 court case in Dayton, Tennessee, that captivated the entire nation. Often called the Monkey Trial, it centered on John Scopes, a high school teacher accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which banned teaching human evolution in public schools. The trial pitted famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow, advocating for science and free thought, against William Jennings Bryan, a populist and religious traditionalist defending biblical literalism. More than a legal battle, it was a cultural clash over religion, education, and the meaning of democracy in America. The trial, famously fueled by intense media coverage, exposed deep societal divides that continue to resonate today. Let's get right to our conversation. Brenda, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Peter.
So what was the inspiration for Keeping the Faith, and what surprised you the most once you started doing this research?
Well, I always begin any book that I'm writing with a question. In this case, the question was really very simple, and it was, why did this trial, 1925, capture the imagination of a whole public, so much so that about 200 journalists went to a small town in Tennessee to cover a trial that should have been really a forgettable event because all that really happened just seemed small. A high school teacher who taught evolution in his biology class. So why was this a major event? And that's what I wanted to know. So I thought I would look at that. And besides, for me, trials are inherently dramatic. And I'm always interested in a trial that captures the imagination because it seems also that there's something that goes on in the courtroom where different people have various points of view that they have to articulate and that a jury or a judge or the spectators listen to. So I wanted to see what the nature of this argument or these arguments were. And so that's really what interested me. And then I think, it was fascinating because the trial really raised questions about freedom, the freedom to worship or not to worship, and what we worship, and who decides what we should worship or believe. And so for those reasons, I became hooked. Yeah.
When you think of like secondary sources for
Mhm.
this event, which has been written, did you try to avoid the secondary sources and just try to go straight to the source, or to like not be swayed by what has been said about this?
I generally avoid secondary sources because secondary sources, no matter how objective in a certain sense they are also filtered through a kind of perspective of the author, which makes sense, just as I have that. But I also wanted to see what's out there, and of course, in this particular case, about 25 or so years ago, more actually, there was a very good book about the Scopes trial that I read, and I thought, well, this is interesting. It's a great book. I like it a lot, but it's not really what I do, and it doesn't ask the questions that I ask. So at that point, I just delve into primary documents. Now, when you say secondary, one of the secondary sources seems to be, for many people, is a movie called Inherit the Wind. And immediately when I said I'm working on the Scopes trial, people would say, "Oh, Inherit the Wind." I had never seen Inherit the Wind. And people said to me, "Oh, you have to see it." And that I avoided. I really did avoid, because I didn't want it in my head, whatever, no matter how good or how bad it was. But of course I saw it. I saw it when I was just about to finish the book, because it was a very sort of legendary editor who was a friend of mine, and he said, "You have to mention it." And I said, okay, I trust you, and I'll mention it. So yeah, the short answer is, to a large extent, I avoid secondary sources, but there is a way in which you can't ignore what's out there and shouldn't ignore what's out there. But my interest is primary documents. My interest is what people said. My interest is transcripts. My interest is diaries. My interest in the letters people are writing at the time. So I can kind of take a magic carpet, as it were, and travel back to the 1920s, which of course you can never do, but that's what I want to do. I want to hear what it sounds like there at that time.
Well, I think honestly, I think you did do that, because I felt like I was back there reading a book. So very descriptive, very character driven. The way you're like weaving the backstories while I'm talking about this story, but then it's like anecdote, boom, and I'm like, oh, and then I'm going back. So you did a great job writing this book. It really felt like I was there.
Thank you. You never know when you're writing it if it's going to work, in the sense. And I know that I took, from my point of view, it was risky because there was so much of what I guess we would call the backstory, or the context, that was really important to me for me to understand what was going on. And as I said, there was a way in which I thought, well, not only is this trial have to be about more than it seems to be. Yes, of course, it's about religion versus science, and there's no doubt about that. But the fact that it captured, as I said, so many people, I needed I needed a broader landscape, really, and that's what I was after in a way.
Yeah, so perfect segue. So my second question, we kind of talked about Inherit the Wind, and Inherit the Wind, which is probably the most popular depiction of this
Yeah,
trial, right?
yeah.
Regardless of the medium, definitely frames this Scopes trial as like just science versus religion. It's a battle between science versus religion. But you kind of present this clash as something different. Like you said, you kind of broaden your lens and you
Mhm.
look at competing visions of democracy. Can you elaborate a little bit on how Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan's views on democracy shape their roles in the trial, and why this perspective is critical for understanding it?
Sure. Let me begin in a slightly different place, and I'll get to Bryan and Darrow, because they're such enormous figures. And in Inherit the Wind, of course, they dominate the film, because William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, two competing sort of adversaries at the trial, they dominated the landscape at the time. We may have forgotten who they are. Some people have, some people haven't. But to answer your question, I want to start from a slightly different angle, and one of the things that interested me when I was looking at this trial was, as I said, the coverage of it. And somebody, the Black historian, W.E.B. Du Bois, wrote about the trial, which I thought was interesting, in his magazine, The Crisis. And he said, the truth is, and we know it, that Dayton, Tennessee is America. And I thought, well, whoa, what do you mean by that? And I think that is a way to get to this issue of, how Bryan and Darrow had competing visions of democracy, because when you're talking about America, you're talking about democracy, really, in this particular sense. And I thought Du Bois is picking up on something that gets lost to us over time. And I was curious as to what that was. And, one way of understanding it is understanding where Bryan was coming from. And just for a minute, just to back up, because maybe nobody remembers him. I don't remember him. Who knows Bryan? But in any event, he was a 3-time presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket. And he was also Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. And the third thing that's interesting about Bryan is he was a progressive. He wasn't a kind of stodgy person who believed women shouldn't have to vote. He had very progressive ideas. But to him, he was called the commoner. And to a certain extent, that's what he was known for, that he stood by the people, the little people, the neglected people, the poor people, the weak people. He wanted, for example, more politically speaking, senators to be directly elected. They weren't. They were appointed by legislatures. He wanted women to have the vote. So that was his sense of democracy, and it's one that we're very familiar with, really. And he believed, in that sense, he believed in states' rights, which is each state should decide for themselves, what should be taught in state-supported schools. That was the heart of the Scopes trial, really. But with his belief in the people and states' rights, if you sort of trace it back and think of it in a context, that also meant that if it's taken to its logical conclusion, if the people voted to keep slavery, then that was okay. That was one aspect of the Democratic Party that's held over from the 19th century and the Civil War. His father knew that. So that's a version of democracy that flew in the face. It's an irony, of course, of his position, really. And he believed that you could enforce moral behavior, hence prohibition, for example. Now, Clarence Darrow is a very different kind of person, even though as an attorney and as a very involved in politics early on, when Bryan first ran president, Darrow supported him because he was a progressive. Darrow was a defense attorney. He always took the side. He was called the attorney for the damned. And he really defended he defended corporations, but he also defended common people nobody else would take on particularly. And he was fighting Bryan at the Scopes trial because he believed that somebody like Bryan and the fundamentalists, who believed that only their version of the Bible could be taught, and it was a fundamentalist version, meaning it was a literal version, he wanted to fight against and stand up against what he believed was an attempt by them to turn the country into a bigoted, intolerant theocracy. And as far as he was concerned, the Bryan point of view, the fundamentalist point of view, would destroy academic freedom. It would outlaw science. It would undercut civil rights. And it would allow prejudice and ignorance to replace learning and liberty. So his view of democracy is very different, as you can see. He wore a pin during the trial with LLL on it, and somebody asked him, what does that mean? And he said, live and let live, in a sense. So he was saying you can't legislate faith. You can't legislate the kinds of things that Bryan really wants to legislate. And the irony, of course, of Bryan's position in the common people is that he was going to decide what was good for the common people. So I think that gives you a kind of sense of the differences between the two. And then, of course, there are subtexts as well and surprises bedded into those points of view.
Yeah, no, the dichotomy between the two men is astonishing in
Yeah.
a sense, to say the least.
Mhm.
You do touch upon this idea that this was a media sensation, and it was. I mean, they ran wires into this little town just to be able to get the media information out quicker, radio and all that stuff.
Exactly.
It was often called a circus. How did the media shape public perception of this trial, and how do you think that
Yeah.
those dynamics are still kind of around today with how media shapes
Yeah.
perception?
It's different. I mean, obviously, 20, 25, 100 years later, there's different kind of media. But there was what we could call a social media of the day, and the social media of the day would be the radio. The radio is fairly new when you think about it. You mentioned how Dayton was wired up, in the sense that the Chicago radio station was carrying the trial, and that's remarkable, really. It's the first, you can't say televised, but it's the first telegraphed, in a sense, trial. And at the same time, there were huge numbers of newspapers coast to coast, and I mentioned internationally, that were covering the trial, often on the front pages. So there you have a kind of media sensation sort of drumming up interest, and the town participated in that, certainly, because there are going to be hot dog vendors and kids selling lemonade on the courtroom, and the courtroom lawn there in front of the courtroom. And you're going to have people coming to town selling different things, read your Bible signs every place, or the town itself. There's a druggist named Darwin, and he put up a big sign, and he said, "Darwin is right inside." And there were all kinds of trinkets that were being sold, souvenirs. So, when Du Bois said, "This is America," there's that part of America is completely commercialized. The judge who presided over the trial, I always get a kick out of this, said that he wouldn't mind holding the trial in a stadium because they were hoping hordes of people would come to town. And then there's certain kinds of journalists who were very, very popular at the time, like H.L. Mencken. I think Hemingway said everybody gets their views. All young people get their views from H.L. Mencken. I don't know if that's such a good thing. He was the person who coined the term monkey trial. He's the person who coined the term Bible Belt. Certain things like that are still with us. He was really a great writer, very funny, really nasty piece of work. And in some sense, his view of the trial, is this group of kind of local yokels hashing things out. That persisted in this whole notion of the trial being called a circus. And you ask about sort of media influence today, and the same kind of thing in a way. I mean, it's mushroomed. Everybody would know that it's mushroomed. But there was a way in which newspapers were as powerful. I don't know if you could say as powerful. No, I wouldn't be able to. Some sociologists can do statistics on, the relative power of different forms. But certainly they were very, very powerful. And you have other characters besides Darrow and Bryan. You have, sort of the precursors of televangelists, really. You have Billy Sunday, who was a preacher, had been a baseball player. His real name was Sunday. And he acted out on the stage. People by the thousands would come to see him perform, and he would punch the devil. And so there was a kind of performance. When you say it was a circus, or we think of the Scopes trial as a circus, yeah, there was a performance aspect of it. And going back to what I said about trials, they're inherently dramatic, but it also means people are performing. There is that performative aspect, even though the issues are real. And then you have other evangelists like Amy Semple McPherson, very deft at using the radio. So all of these converge in a sense in Dayton, surprisingly enough, this little town. And it's very interesting in that sense. I
Yeah.
wish we could go. I mean, 1925, we can go now.
Yeah, slightly different, I would say.
Well, yeah.
You described the Scopes trial as a lens for understanding America's ongoing struggles with freedom, religion, and education. Can you elaborate on that and maybe point to some specific parallels that you see between cultural and political divisions of
Sure.
100 years ago and today?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned earlier, the context for the trial is very interesting in terms of the different things that are going on. One of the things that are going on, just a year before the trial, in 1924, there was a law passed in Congress, basically shutting the door on immigrants, which is kind of shocking because what's shocking about it is not that that happened, but what's shocking is very much like today when the question of immigration is very much in the forefront of present political discussions, for example. So that's one way in which you can see a kind of uh, overlap, and certainly there were issues too, very strong issues. We didn't get into I can't do everything, but certainly the Ku Klux Klan, was very important during the time of the trial. And in fact, I talked about 1924 is the Immigration Act, and just after the trial, not even the next year, but in a few weeks, there's a huge march in Washington. The Klan members took something like 46 special trains to get to Washington. So like 20, 30, 40,000 Klans people there. So this question of race and civil rights and immigration were all folded into the trial. We could go on forever and ever about how exactly that happened, but you can see these kind of cultural and political divisions that we deal with today, very much part of what was going on then. And then, of course, we didn't even really mention, but the ACLU was involved. The ACLU isn't that old, and the American Civil Liberties Union, which really, in some sense, started the trial because to them, the law that prohibited the teaching of evolution in schools, the so-called Butler Act, was an infringement of the First Amendment. And today, we're talking about the First Amendment all of the time. And the ACLU, not very long ago, filed a lawsuit on behalf of PEN America and public schools, challenging the book removals that they said violate students' amendments to receive information, in that particular sense. So that's just the beginning of the kinds of ways you can see the, no, I wouldn't say the reverberations, almost I would say the same kinds of issues in different and more contemporary clothes, and not that different in some cases. And you have the Oklahoma legislature, debating whether a resolution that declares Christ as king elevates one religion over another. That's the Scopes issue. That's when Darrow and the defenders of Scopes are saying, what about other religions besides this particular one? You can't mandate. So I see that. Also, just one other topic, because First Amendment, race, immigration, also science. I mean, how can we not talk about science? First Amendment is supposed to protect religion and science education. So, the Scopes trial is really very important in that regard, because science is, again, something, and the research that goes into science and the meaning of certain scientific discoveries and the importance of that also being discussed all of the time. And people, for some reason, well, it's another discussion, are afraid of science.
Yeah. And kind of, we're kind of drawn to an end, but
No.
thanks. The Scopes trial is often seen as a victory for science, right? But before we get into kind of how that continues to this day as well, how was this taken at the time it happened? So when the trial ended, how did America view the result of this trial?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. Sort of, again, I'm going to start from a strange position in a way. Clarence Darrow, the ACLU is ambivalent about him, but he argued, I think, from my point of view, brilliantly, the side that he was arguing about why this particular law infringed on the First Amendment. But he also, because of his own theatrical nature, he was also taking the arguments that he was making to the press. So, he was very much a public figure. And so in some sense, even though of course Scopes was found guilty because he in fact had violated that law, what Darrow and the defense team were able to do was, by arguing the case in the papers and by actually revealing the contradictions in Bryan's own position, which is again another subject, even though they lost the trial, they in a sense won, and they got what they wanted. One was to show that Bryan didn't know what he was talking about, and also, two, to get the matter to the Tennessee Supreme Court, where it went and died, by the way. Okay, so forgetting that. But as a result, in the irony, of course, of seeing the trial as a circus, it's a way of negating the importance of the trial, but at the same time, it revealed that we don't want to do this again. So in a sense, the Butler Act, that's the act that we're talking about, the law, stayed on the books, but nobody was enforcing it. So in that sense, there's a way in which the Scopes trial was a victory. And in some sense, it's true that the Butler Act wasn't repealed till the 1960s, but there were other similar acts. Like in 1987, there was a Louisiana law stipulating that creationism, which is a version of the Butler Act, had to be given equal time in the classroom, and the Supreme Court struck that down. So there was a way in which that victory persisted. At the same time, from my point of view, it also mobilized the fundamentalist groups that supported the group that supported Bryan. It mobilized the sort of previously unengaged fundamentalists, and in that sense, they began to emerge later as a political force, which in the 1920s they existed, they were powerful, but it wasn't quite a political force in the same way that emerged later.
I wonder if these guys sitting there in that courtroom would think about the fact that here we are 100 years later, and the conversation still continues.
Yeah. It's funny because Darrow turned to another lawyer. They were sitting there in the courtroom, and he turned to him and he whispered, and he said, "This is 20th century America." And I think of that because I think here we are sitting, and I sometimes want to say, this is 21st century America. So, I think they wouldn't be entirely surprised because they knew that they had to continue to fight for what they believed. It's not over. The fight it's continual.
Yeah. It'll be here way after we're gone. It will continue. Brenda, before I let you go, I always ask this kind of, I guess, fun question. Every writer is a reader.
It's all fun, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. So with every writer being a reader, and if I was to look at your bookcase that you've had since you were a little child, so this doesn't have to be history, and I'm not asking for your favorite book because that would be unfair, but what two books would I definitely find on your bookshelf? On your life bookshelf?
Well, that's a hard one, but I would say one thing pops right to mind, and one is Moby Dick, the novel Moby Dick, the 19th century novel Moby Dick, which is about everything, and it also, for people who are daunted by its subject matter, which is whales and its size, it's also very funny, and it is about science and religion and faith and all the things that we've been politics, all the things we've been talking about. It doesn't have women in it, though.
I guess a
That-
product
that's
of its time, right?
Yeah, I'd say the Scarlet Letter has women, but they weren't doing so well. So you would definitely find that book. As the other one is hard for me to actually
Pinpoint.
pinpoint what the other, but it would be a novel. There's no doubt about it. The other one that pops to mind is also a 19th century novel, and it's Middlemarch by George Eliot. I read a lot of fiction. It's very important to me.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like that comes across in your writing style.
That's sort of my sort of implicit goal is narrative nonfiction, which means you want to turn the page. I hope.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what are you working on next? Are you already deep in another book, or you giving yourself a break?
No breaks. It's too much fun. Too much fun. Then I get to talk to people like you. I was commissioned by the Yale University series of Jewish lives to write a small biography on Fiorello LaGuardia.
So you're busy.
And it's fun. Yeah.
Brenda, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. This really was an amazing conversation.
And look forward to talking to you again.